The air in the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite hummed with the low thrum of filtration systems and the quiet whir of analytical instruments. It was a sterile, precise environment, built for dissection and revelation. I stood over a stainless steel counter, the cool metal a familiar anchor beneath my gloved hands. Before me lay a series of evidence trays, each holding fragments of a story that had been officially closed before I'd even opened the first file. The initial reports were concise, almost clinical. Aris Thorne, the brilliant but reclusive bioengineer, found deceased in his high-security research facility. Cause: catastrophic lab accident. The official narrative leaned heavily on either a tragic miscalculation involving his groundbreaking, potentially world-changing research, or a desperate act of self-destruction. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman who usually didn't miss a beat, had signed off on it, citing the sheer devastation of the scene as proof of an uncontrollable chain reaction. I picked up a laminated photograph. It depicted a section of Thorne's lab, or what was left of it. Twisted metal, scorched conduits, shattered containment units. The blast had ripped through the central chamber, vaporizing equipment and leaving behind a chaotic tableau of destruction. The heat had been intense, charring surfaces, fusing polymers, and turning complex machinery into abstract sculptures of melted alloy. It was a powerful visual, compelling in its violence, and it certainly supported the conclusion of an accidental, self-contained event. My gaze drifted to another image, a close-up of a pressure valve, its casing buckled inward, surrounded by an iridescent residue. The report identified it as a byproduct of the experimental compound Thorne had been developing, a biocatalyst with unprecedented energy potential. The theory was simple: a breach, a reaction, an explosion. End of story. But I wasn't in the business of simple stories. My work began where the obvious ended, in the microscopic gaps between cause and effect, where the whispers of intent could sometimes be found. I moved to the forensic microscope, its powerful lenses waiting to magnify the invisible. On the slide was a sliver of material, no larger than a grain of sand, carefully extracted from the edge of a console that had somehow survived the blast relatively intact. It was a fragment of the console's outer casing, made of a proprietary composite designed to withstand extreme temperatures and corrosive agents. Yet, this piece bore a peculiar discoloration. I adjusted the focus, bringing the intricate patterns into sharp relief. Under 200 times magnification, the discoloration wasn't just a random scorch mark. It was a precise, almost surgical burn. The edges were sharp, defined, as if a laser had etched a miniature landscape onto the composite. And within the deepest channels of this microcrater, I saw it, a faint, almost invisible crystalline trace. My breath hitched, a silent, internal shift. This wasn't consistent with the wide, indiscriminate heat of a chemical explosion, which would have left a more diffuse, radial burn pattern. This was concentrated, localized, and far too neat. The report mentioned extensive thermal damage and widespread chemical contamination, which was true enough for the overall scene, but this tiny, anomalous detail contradicted the source of the heat. It suggested a point-specific application of energy, something external, something controlled. I leaned closer, my eye pressed against the eyepiece. The crystalline trace shimmered faintly. It wasn't organic, not a byproduct of Thorne's biocatalyst. Its structure was inorganic, a silicate, but one with an unusual metallic sheen. I ran a quick preliminary spectral analysis. The results blinked onto the small screen beside the microscope, trace elements of vanadium and niobium, metals not commonly found in the lab's structural components, nor in the known composition of Thorne's experimental compounds. This wasn't a random speck. This was an outlier. A foreign body. My mind began to reconstruct the scene, not as the reports described it, but as this tiny fragment hinted. If the explosion was merely an accident, a spontaneous reaction, why would there be evidence of such a targeted, external energy application before the main event? And why these specific, unusual elements embedded within a burn pattern that didn't fit the narrative of a massive, uncontrolled blast? The official conclusion, that Thorne's death was an accident or suicide, felt like a hastily constructed facade. The destruction was too complete, almost theatrical, as if designed to mask something. This microscopic trace, this unusual burn pattern, was a whisper from the wreckage. I pulled back from the microscope, the sterile hum of the suite suddenly feeling less comforting, more like the distant drone of an unseen predator. The tension in the room, previously a product of my own meticulous focus, now felt like a palpable presence. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their tracks. Someone had been intimately familiar with Thorne's work, the lab's intricacies, and the precise point at which to apply a very specific, very controlled force to trigger a much larger, more chaotic event. This wasn't an accident. And it certainly wasn't a suicide. This was a masterpiece of misdirection, and I had just found its first, almost imperceptible flaw. My work was just beginning. Misery twinged. I moved closer to what remained of Thorne's main workstation, careful not to disturb anything. The console was a melted sculpture of plastic and wires, but beneath its ruin, a faint, almost imperceptible detail snagged my attention. A scorch mark on the reinforced floor, no larger than my thumb, stood out against the broader charring. It was a perfect, almost geometric circle, darker, more intense than the surrounding damage, as if a pinpoint of extreme heat had been applied before the general conflagration. It didn't fit the narrative of a chaotic explosion. Explosions were messy, unpredictable. This mark suggested precision, control. It was a whisper of intent and a scream of destruction, and I already knew this case was going to be anything but simple. The preliminary autopsy report, delivered by the medical examiner in her perpetually cool office in the police department basement holding forensic samples, only deepened my skepticism. No defensive wounds, Reed, he reported, his voice dry as he flipped through the digital images. But the thermal damage. It's peculiar. The core temperature sustained by the body suggests a much higher, more focused energy release than the general lab temperature would indicate for the duration. She pointed to a detailed scan. See here? Localized tissue necrosis, almost surgical in its precision, despite the overall widespread trauma. It's like he was hit directly by something incredibly hot, something contained, before the lab itself went up. So, not just a bystander to a general explosion? I asked, leaning forward. No. He was the focal point, or at least, a highly targeted element within the event. And there's this. She pushed a small, clear evidence bag across the table. Inside, nestled against a sterile cotton swab, was a minuscule, almost invisible speck. Found it embedded in the epidermal layer of his forearm, post-mortem. It's not organic, not metal, and certainly not anything we'd expect to find in a bioengineering lab. It's synthetic, almost like a microscopic piece of hardened plastic, but with a unique crystalline structure. The speck was barely visible to the naked eye, a testament to the ME's meticulous work. A non-lab-related trace element, embedded in Thorne's arm, suggesting a direct, intimate contact with something alien to his environment. The plot, as they say, thickened. My first stop for leads was Dr. Silas Vance, a contemporary of Thorne's and a known academic rival. His lab, a stark contrast to Thorne's high-tech fortress, was a maze of bubbling beakers and handwritten notes. Vance was a wiry man with a perpetual frown etched into his face, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke. Thorne was intense, Vance began, gesturing vaguely with a gloved hand. Brilliant, yes, but ruthless. He'd step on anyone to get ahead. My research, for example. He tried to discredit it, steal my funding. We had words, many times. Heated words. Did those words ever escalate to physical threats, Dr. Vance? I asked, observing his fidgeting hands. He scoffed. Please, read. I'm a scientist, not a brawler. And besides, I was at a conference in Geneva when the incident occurred. Plenty of witnesses. His alibi checked out, but his resentment was palpable. He had motive, certainly, but lacked opportunity for the physical act, and more importantly, the specific expertise to stage such a complex event. Next, I sought out Maya, Thorne's former research assistant. He was a young woman, sharp and intense, but now she seemed diminished, her shoulders slumped. I found her in the stark white text of the operational timeline burned into my vision, each line a cold, calculated instruction. Not a system diagnostic, as it had initially appeared. This was a blueprint for murder, meticulously disguised. Environmental manipulation, indeed, but not for research, for eradication. The precision of it, the chilling foresight, made my stomach clench. Dr. Thorne hadn't made a miscalculation, he'd been murdered by someone who understood his systems intimately enough to turn them against him, then hide the weapon in plain sight. This wasn't an accident, nor was it a lone wolf. This was orchestrated. I leaned closer to the monitor, fingers hovering over the touchscreen. The timestamp on the last modification, hidden deep within the system logs, matched the window of opportunity I'd identified earlier, the brief period when the lab's internal security had been momentarily, subtly, compromised. And the access credentials used? A ghost in the machine, but one I now knew had a name. I need the lead detective on the line, now, I stated, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the server room. My colleague, who had been meticulously cataloging peripheral data, looked up, startled by the urgency in my tone. And get a team ready. We've got our killer, and it's bigger than we thought. Hours later, the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite buzzed with a different kind of energy. The sterile quiet had given way to hushed conversations, the clack of keyboards, and the low thrum of multiple monitors displaying various data streams. I stood before a large wall-mounted screen, a composite image of the operational timeline displayed prominently, alongside a detailed breakdown of the network intrusion. The evidence was irrefutable. The digital breadcrumbs led directly to David Thorne, not just as the perpetrator of the system manipulation. As the architect of the entire, elaborate deception. He's been apprehended, the lead detective confirmed, stepping up beside me, his face etched with a mix of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. Picked him up at his residence an hour ago. No resistance, just a blank stare. Like he was expecting it. He was, I replied, my gaze fixed on the timeline. Every step was planned, including his own exit strategy, which, ironically, led us right to him. He was too clever, too confident. The detective nodded slowly. And the wider implications. The initial questioning, the data we've pulled from his personal devices and OmniCorp servers. This goes deep, read. Much deeper than just a family squabble or corporate espionage. I suspected as much, I said, recalling the sheer complexity of the system Thorne had developed. The lengths someone had gone to cover it up. No single individual could have pulled off this level of infiltration and misdirection without a network of complicity. The corporate veil is tearing, and it's revealing some ugly truths about what they were willing to do to control Dr. Thorne's research. The revelations were swift and brutal. Within days, the story exploded. Media outlets, initially reporting a tragic lab accident, pivoted dramatically, fueled by leaks from the ongoing investigation. The name Dr. Aris Thorne became synonymous with both genius and betrayal. The public's shock was palpable, a collective gasp as the layers of corporate malfeasance and scientific ambition were peeled back. My internal reactions mirrored the external chaos, a sense of grim satisfaction that justice was being served, but also a growing unease about the implications. The ethical debate surrounding Dr. Thorne's final project became a global talking point. Was his research a potential cure-all or a weapon in waiting? The questions echoed in my mind as I reviewed the fragments of his work that had survived the destructive event. The stakes had been raised exponentially. It's a Pandora's box, a colleague remarked one afternoon, watching a news report on the suite's auxiliary monitor. The anchor spoke with hushed gravity about the Thorne affair and its global ramifications. Everyone wants a piece of what he left behind, and no one trusts anyone else to have it. I understood the sentiment. My role was done, in a sense, the murderer identified, the conspiracy laid bare. But the aftermath, the wider implications, felt far from over. The real fight, I suspected, was just beginning, and it would be fought on a much larger, more dangerous stage. The ghost of Dr. Aris Thorne's work, his final, world-changing project, still lingered, a potent and dangerous force waiting to be unleashed by the next ambitious hand. I understood the sentiment. I stood before the large, stainless steel examination table, sterile and cold, though the physical evidence from Thorne's lab had long since been processed, catalogued, and moved into secure storage. My gaze wasn't on the empty surface, but through it, past the steel and concrete, to the silent figures of the deceased bioengineer and the calculating eyes of his killer. The air still hummed with the ghosts of their choices, the echo of ambition and betrayal. The official reports were filed, thick stacks of paper detailing every microscopic fiber, every chemical residue, every burn pattern. The prosecuting attorney had assured me the case was ironclad. The evidence, painstakingly collected and meticulously analyzed, painted a damning picture, not of an accident, nor a suicide, but a cold, deliberate act designed to look like both. The perpetrator, a colleague driven by envy and a desperate desire for Thorne's research, had nearly succeeded in their grand deception. But nearly was a word I learned to despise. It meant a truth almost buried, a justice almost denied. My focus returned to the present, to the lingering scent of disinfectant and the low hum of the ventilation system. The case had concluded on paper, but in my mind, the questions still resonated. Thorne's work, potentially world-changing in its scope, had become a weapon, a prize, and ultimately, a death sentence. The line between groundbreaking innovation and profound peril had never seemed so thin, so easily breached by human failing. It was a revelation that burrowed deep, a disquieting truth about the very fabric of scientific progress. The drive to innovate, to push boundaries, was a powerful force, but untethered from moral compass, it could swiftly turn corrosive. I remembered the early days of the investigation, the initial rush to label it a tragic accident. The burn patterns on the equipment, the carefully staged structural damage, it all pointed to an uncontrolled chemical reaction. But the microscopic trace on Thorne's hand, a substance not native to his lab, and the peculiar trajectory of the thermal event, had unraveled the facade. My work was to listen. The personal toll of these investigations was undeniable. The sleepless nights spent poring over data, the relentless pursuit of an almost invisible detail, the weight of knowing that a life's truth hung on my meticulousness, it wore at the edges. I saw the faces of the victims, not just Thorne, but all the others whose stories I had unearthed. A colleague, the lead detective on the Thorne case, entered the suite, a thin file tucked under their arm. "Read. The final report is with the administrator. Prosecution has everything they need." "Good work," the detective said, a genuine weariness in their tone. "Took a lot to pull this one apart. A real mess." "They always are," I replied, the words a quiet affirmation of my commitment. Despite the exhaustion, despite the often bleak nature of the truths I uncovered, there was an unwavering resolve that settled in my bones. Forensic justice wasn't just a job, it was a fundamental necessity. It was the unwavering pursuit of clarity in the face of chaos, the steadfast dedication to ensuring that the evidence spoke for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The detective gave a curt nod and left, the soft click of the door closing behind them leaving me once again in the quiet hum of the suite. Thorne's case, for me, was closed. The killer was identified, the motive understood, the method exposed. The wheels of justice, slow as they sometimes were, would turn. But the broader implications, the precarious balance between progress and peril, the eternal struggle against human greed and ambition, those questions lingered, an unsettling current beneath the surface. I walked to my workbench, the familiar clutter of my tools a comforting sight. A new file, thicker than usual, sat waiting. Its cover was blank, save for a cryptic case number. No name. No victim. Just a number, an enigma. My gaze settled on it, a familiar anticipation stirring within me. The work, it seemed, was never truly over.